rise to speak to this important motion because of what we witnessed this weekend. First of all, the delay of the government to say anything at all, to follow our allies in at least condemning this in a reasonable amount of time. We didn't see that. But imagine being part of the government who 6 years ago voted in favor of listing the IRGC. And imagine seeing what happened this weekend with 300 projectiles firing directly on a Democratic ally. Imagine being part of a government where the Saudis were better allies to our friend and Democratic partner than the government of Canada has been. Imagine getting up in this House and saying that today this is not an important motion to debate after witnessing 300 projectiles directly fired on a friend and Democratic ally. You don't have to imagine it. It just happened. 6 years of foot dragging, where the answer, it's been asked hundreds of times in this House, what day, what time, how the government's going to list and ban the IRGC terrorists who are operating openly in our country from this country. Today, in the House, Madam Speaker, the answer was exactly the same. We're trying, we're consulting, we're working on it. This has been the answer for 6 years, where the Prime Minister himself got up and voted to ban the IRGC. Today, the mullahs in Iran and their proxies are fighting wars that kill Canadians. They killed hostages with Canadian citizenship. They have killed 55 Canadians in the downing of Flight PS 752, 30 permanent residents. Since 2015, this government has done nothing but appease the mullahs in Iran. The regime in Iran, the Prime Minister himself meeting with the Foreign Minister, bowing his head with respect in 2016, not even a year after the flight was down. It was absolutely disgusting to watch. There are communities all over the country who know that operatives of the regime openly spend money, have blood money, buying homes, assets in this country. Their kids go to school in universities here. Just floodgates open. We know that they intimidate Canadians in every single neighborhood. We know that the chief of police of Tehran had worked out in a Good Life Fitness in Midtown Toronto. We know that senior members of the regime are eating steak dinners in fancy restaurants in Toronto openly with impunity. This is after 8 years of this government. And the worst, Madam Speaker, what we saw in the streets of Toronto. At the very moment the projectile missiles fired on a Democratic friend and ally, there was celebration and jubilation in the streets of our biggest cities. This is, the failure to denounce that from a party that we know is capable of denouncing all kinds of protests in this country. If you were at all concerned with the desecration of a statue in front of Parliament Hill and you have said nothing about what is happening in our streets, the mobs of protesters with covered faces brandishing swastikas, I can't help you. But what we can do today as a country is ban the open operation, the ability to raise money, the ability to organize of the IRGC terrorists that live amongst us. We know that there are 700 here, at least, that we know about, that are already in this country, and yet we get the same answers over and over. It's been asked no less than 100 times in this House. And the answer is always the same. Something, something, we take terrorism seriously. Something, something, we're working on it. Something, something, we're looking into it. It's been 6 years. And if this weekend and the events from this weekend haven't changed that answer, then I think we have a really, really big problem with this government. I think we have a really big problem about how it treats terrorism, how it treats national security in this country, how it treats the very communities that elect its members to come here, how members of parliament from the other side, particularly the member of parliament from Richmond Hill, meets with agents of the IRGC in his office. It is open and it is known. I will say it inside of the House and outside of the House. His community knows that. And it is shameful. And the fact that the answer is the same today on they're working on it or they're looking at different ways to do it is absolutely shameful. The IRGC agents that we have living in this country, the 700 of them that we know about, potentially more, intimidate Canadians every single day. They intimidate Canadians in neighborhoods right across the GTA, in North Vancouver. We hear them. Our own conversations with them, Madam Speaker, happen sometimes with a blurred out background where they are so scared about making the call to somebody in government or their MP for some help. They blur out the background, they sit in their car away from their home because they are terrified of the intimidation that they face here. There are thousands of Iranian Canadians, freedom-loving Iranian Canadians, that fled the regime to find safety and a better life here in Canada. And the expectation, their expectation from their government, is that they will be kept safe. They will be kept free of intimidation. They will be able to go to school and go to work. They would be able to talk to their MP from their home without being terrified of being watched by the regime. That is what we're dealing with in Canada. That is what the community is dealing with in Canada. They've said so. And they continue to call on this government, after 6 years of doing nothing, to at least list these operatives as the terrorists that they are. Today in Canada, they can raise money, they can have meetings, they can organize. This is the regime, this is the Islamic regime in Iran that has been fighting proxy wars against our ally until the direct attack on the weekend. This is the regime in Iran that has funded Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. This is the most destabilizing force in all of the Middle East and one of the most destabilizing forces in the entire world. And the very fact that this government answers the question the same way today as it has for the last 6 years, as it has for 2 years before that, is a darn shame. Because there are people in this country that want to see this government take national security and terrorism seriously. And it is about time that they do that. It is about time that they do that for every single freedom-loving Canadian who sees what's going on in their streets, where the progressive left has been co-opted by the Iranian regime. Things like Al-Quds Day, funded entirely by the mullahs in Iran to destabilize our own streets here. It is unbelievable that their answer, after 6 years, is exactly the same. We're working on it. We're going to do it. We've got a tough regime, or we've got a tough sanctions regime on Iran. They don't even know how many operatives are here. They don't know how many people they are going to list on their list because they don't have a list. And if they did have a list, they would produce that list. This is a government that doesn't take terrorism seriously. This is a government that doesn't take national security seriously. And soon there will be a government that does. But until then, they can do one thing. They can ban the IRGC from organizing, from fundraising, and from living freely here and intimidating our own citizens. That's what this motion calls on, and I hope they vote in favor of it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver West, Sunshine Coast, Sky Country.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Thornhill for her speech. The Iranian regime has brought untold harm onto its own citizens and caused chaos throughout the region and the world. And find no argument with me on that. The United States has listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity, but in doing so has actually had a profound effect on a number of Canadians. There are about 30,000 Canadians in Canada that were conscripted to be part of the IRGC. Through no fault of their own, they're not able to travel to the U.S. for vacations, for work opportunities, and it's also their spouses and their children as well. And so this is already having a profound impact. I actually had an email today from a constituent that was asking about this. And so my question to my honourable colleague is, how would she go about ensuring that by listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity, it wouldn't bring these types of issues onto our own citizens, and how that might be approached?
Member for Thornhill.
Madam Speaker, it is dealt with in C-350, and he could have passed it right now if they didn't oppose it right here on the floor of the House of Commons. But this member is giving a bureaucratic answer for a regime that subjugates women, that kills members of the LGBTQ community, that kidnaps and tortures its own people, and that has brought that over into our country to intimidate people in his own riding, in my riding, in many of the ridings that people here represent. That bureaucratic answer, he's going to have to tell his members who are constantly being intimidated by a regime that is the most destabilizing regime in the entire world.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for her speech this afternoon on this very important concurrence motion. I'd like her to comment on what the Minister of Foreign Affairs said just before question period. When she stood in front of the microphone, she spoke to an Israeli counterpart and said after the weekend attacks they should just take the wind and de-escalate the situation. Now, obviously, we'd like to see a de-escalation of the situation in the Middle East, but to imply that Israel somehow should take the win because there were no deaths, and fortunately as well, Saudi Arabia and Jordan intervened and shot down many of the airborne missiles and weapons that were sent to Israel. So I'm just wondering if she can comment on the Minister of Foreign Affairs' comments.
Member for Thornhill.
I can't keep up with the multiple positions of the Minister of Foreign Affairs or her inability to ever talk about this issue without being naive. I couldn't do that, but I do know one thing, that this Prime Minister and this government has outsourced their foreign policy to the progressive left, and it has resulted in Canada actually following a motion that was just passed in this House with their own support by stopping arms sales to Israel, and then out of the other side of their mouth, telling Israel that telling the Israelis that Canada stands with them. You can't walk and chew gum at the same time, or at least this foreign minister can't. And it's unfortunate to see that a long-standing consensus of support for a democratic friend and ally has been just left to languish on the floor of the House of Commons by these Liberals, and there will be a time where we will return to that long-standing consensus in this country, and that time cannot come soon enough.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable parliamentary secretary to the government house leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm wondering if the member could tell us when it is that she believes that they should have received that designation. She often makes reference to 6 years ago. Is that when the Conservatives would have put it in? When would they have put in the designation?
Member for Thornhill.
Madam Speaker, this is a party that unanimously voted for it in June of 2018. And that was 6 years ago. They could have done it any single day in those 6 years. And the fact that the answer is the same today after what happened this weekend is absolutely shameful. And that member should be ashamed of himself for even asking that question.